I thank the Home Secretary for advance sight of her statement. The whole country is shocked by the rape gang scandal. Over years or decades, thousands and maybe tens of thousands of vulnerable young girls were systematically raped by organised gangs of men, predominantly of Pakistani heritage. Instead of those victims being protected and the perpetrators prosecuted, those girls were systematically failed. Many cases were covered up because of absurd concerns about so-called community relations. Police often did not investigate. Local councils covered things up. The Crown Prosecution Service frequently failed victims. And those raising concerns were frequently accused of racism. Never again can people be silenced in that way. And I pay tribute to people who have raised these cases over the years, starting, I think, with former Labour MP Anne Cryer, nearly 2 decades ago, who first raised these problems and bravely persevered, despite accusations of racism and worse, including from her very own colleagues. And let me just say, in that vein, a word on the Prime Minister's comments this morning. It is not far right to stand up for victims of mass rape. And smearing people.
Order.
It's those concerns.
Shadows. People want to hear the statement. Philp.
Smearing people who raise those issues is exactly how this ended up getting covered up in the first place. Now, I will, of course, repeat now what I said yesterday, that intimidation and threats towards elected members of Parliament and ministers, including the member for Birmingham Yardley, are completely wrong. Now, as the Home Secretary said, action is important, and the last government took extensive action, starting with the original Jay report commissioned in 2014 by previous Home Secretary, now Baroness May. A year later, she commissioned the independent investigation into child sexual abuse, and it was Sajid Javid who commissioned data collection in about 2018. Now, in relation to the response to the ICSA report published in 2022, it is not true to say the last government took no action. The last government established the Grooming Gangs Task Force, whose work led to 550 arrests of perpetrators in the first year and safeguarded 4,500 victims. So my first question to the Home Secretary is this: can she confirm to the House, I'm sure she can, but can she confirm to the House that the Grooming Gangs Task Force work will continue and I hope even be stepped up? Secondly, as part of the work of the Grooming Gangs Task Force, and again implementing one of the recommendations of the ICSA report, in April 2023, the last government mandated data collection in relation to ethnicity that the Home Secretary also referred to. Will she confirm, now it's been going for about a year and a half, or over a year and a half, will the Home Secretary now confirm that data on the ethnicity of perpetrators will be published? Now, as the Home Secretary, of course, has acknowledged, one of ICSA's main recommendations was mandatory reporting to the police by people in positions of responsibility. Now, the last government was in the process of implementing that recommendation via a measure in the Criminal Justice Bill, which fell with the early election. Now, I'm glad to hear the Home Secretary has just announced that she will continue with the last government's proposals in her forthcoming bill, and she can be assured that the opposition will support the government in the continuation of that measure. Now, finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, the Home Secretary did not address the need for a full national public inquiry on this scandal. Now, while the last government did initiate the ICSA inquiry under Professor Jay, that was mainly directed at other child sexual abuse and exploitation issues, and it only covered 6 of the towns involved in the gang rape scandal. So it didn't cover everything. We do need to get to the truth. We now have evidence, new evidence of further that is of interest to the public, including what Simon Danchuk, the former Labour MP for Rochdale, said about the way he was pressured into staying silent. We have evidence about local authorities covering this up. We have the third report last year on Operation Span, commissioned by the Mayor of Greater Manchester, Andy Burnham, exposing failings by the Crown Prosecution Service, which are extremely serious. This all needs to be looked into, so will the Home Secretary commission that national statutory public inquiry which can compel witnesses to attend, that can requisition evidence, and where it can take evidence under oath. And if the government will not order that statutory national public inquiry, we will table an amendment to the Children Wellbeing Bill later this week to put the matter to a vote. And I hope members across the House will vote for that full statutory public inquiry so we can get to the truth.
Home Secretary.
But just say to the Shadow Home Secretary, this is an issue in which, when I was the Shadow Home Secretary, when I was the Chair of the Home Affairs Select Committee, I worked with government ministers on, and in which there has been cross-party consensus on the need to tackle these very serious and vile crimes. These are the most appalling crimes against children. The brutal rape, repeated multiple rapes of children, particularly young girls, but also young boys, in the most appalling of circumstances, and the abuse of trust for those children, often it be people who should have protected them, who should have looked after them, and where institutions failed to keep them safe. That's why the independent inquiry was so important. It's why I called for it. It's where many other people in this House, across this House, called for it, and it's why we supported it when the previous government set it up. But the truth is, there just has not been enough action to tackle these vile crimes. There hasn't been enough change to policies, to the way in which services operate at local level. And that is a deep failing that those changes have not taken place. He used the example of the duty to report. This is incredibly important because it is about preventing any chance of people turning a blind eye, of professionals turning a blind eye to abuse, of people covering up child abuse and exploitation in the most appalling way. It's about making it a criminal offence. And yet we called for it 10 years ago. He had a decade in order to introduce that, a decade that we have now lost without having those powers and those measures in place. He rightly talks about the task force. I mentioned that in my response, and we've supported not just continuing with that task force, but actually accelerating its work. So it has increased. The last quarter of arrests have increased on the previous quarter, a significant increase in arrests, because the thing I want to see most of all is I want to see perpetrators behind bars. I want to see perpetrators pay the price for the vile crimes against children. And in order to do that, we have to improve policing performance and the coordinated work between police and local councils across the country in order to do this. So yes, we will accelerate the work of the task force. But he refers to the ethnicity data. It's already been published. It was published in November. The latest report was published in November as a result of the work of the task force. I would just say to him, though, I don't think that the data that they have gathered actually is adequate. I don't think it goes far enough. I think there's a real problem with the way in which we collect data, and police forces collect data. It's very haphazard. There isn't a proper system for collecting data, for having proper performance framework for policing, because again, to be honest, I think his government withdrew too far from policing and having the kind of standards we need to have in place. I hope we can work together on having a stronger performance framework, having a clearer framework of data, including dealing with these issues around ethnicity. And the issue, back in 2015, we had the consensus on the need to make sure that race and ethnicity are never used as an excuse not to tackle crime. That somehow the fact that vulnerable girls supposedly consented when they did not is used as an excuse not to tackle crime. We can never accept those excuses. I hope that we will have agreement between us on how we do that. And in terms of inquiries, I would just say to him, his party launched the child abuse inquiry. They set the terms of reference. They provided the substantial funding for it. and he could have raised concerns about its terms of reference, about the scope of it, about the extent of its reports at any point, including at any point since it reported, and he didn't do so until last week. I hope he will support now the work that Oldham is determined to take forward, the work that we can hopefully see replicated from Telford. The Telford inquiry was a really important one. And I hope too that he is prepared to work with the victims and survivors panel, which will help us take forward exactly the kinds of further investigations, reviews and inquiries that should take place both at local level and across the country in order to make sure we protect child victims.
Select Committee Chair Debbie Abrahams.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I welcome my right